Hi, I'm Alexandra Kapp, and I present you my topic on collection, usage, and privacy of mobility data in the enterprise and public administrations. I'm a PhD student at the University of Applied Sciences in Berlin, and I'm part of the research project FreeMove, where we focus on researching the privacy of mobility data. Research on privacy of mobility data is commonly motivated with the need for data-driven solutions, especially for mobility or urban planning processes. This then raised the issue of the privacy of mobility data, where privacy-enhancing technologies are researched to provide such privacy, especially focusing on balancing the utility-privacy trade-off. So far so good, but how do I measure the utility, and what does a utility loss for practitioners actually mean? We first need a good understanding of those use cases in practice to answer those questions. So how is which data exactly used for what kind of analysis? On the search for answers, I found many assumptions, maybe also vague statements about urban planning, but not a lot of concrete information what is actually done. Even less information was available on current usage of privacy-enhancing technologies within practitioners' work. So are there already any PETs used? Which are those? Those were questions that we're interested in to then be able to give profound recommendations on privacy-enhancing technologies to use in practice for mobility data, because this is the objective of our FreeMove project. And in order to do that, we first need a comprehensive understanding of real-life practices. This is why we decided to conduct expert interviews. So I video called with 13 experts from German organizations from the private and public sector working with mobility data, all in somewhat leading positions. So companies were from public administrations, public transport companies, mobility platforms, automotive manufacturers, sensor companies, market research companies. So after the interviews, we then evaluated them with a qualitative analysis, where the main categories were the following four, which you can see here. So data sources, privacy enhancement, data analysis and modeling, and purposes, which build the context where mobility data is used in. So I first asked questions on which mobility data sources are collected, acquired from third parties by practitioners, what kind of personal information that data contained, what granularity the data has, how frequent the data is collected. Then I asked questions about privacy enhancement, if they already have any measures in place, if so, which ones those are. And I put the privacy enhancement in this graph between the data source and the data analysis, even though this can of course also be positioned differently. So for example, after the data analysis, but just for simplicity it is put there. Then I ask questions about what types of analyses or modelings were performed, and then one important question, what those analyses were performed for. So what are the purposes? Because analyses are usually not a mean in itself, but there's some kind of insight you want to gain, and in the best case even some kind of action that would come out of that insight. So let's jump into the results, the data sources and responsibilities. Within the literature you do find information about data sources, and they also mainly overlap with the ones that were stated in the interviews. So surveys, sensor data, transaction data, GPS tracking, mobile phone data. Interestingly, routing queries was a data source that I did not find in any literature so far. But in addition to the sources, I was interested to know who is using which kind of data, and additionally, who provides the data and who uses the data. This distinction is important because the responsibility for privacy is usually seen within the providing entity, and thus this distinction is important to determine who the target group for a certain privacy-enhancing technology is. So for example, with mobile phone data, commonly used in research, the provider is usually the cellular network provider, and they aggregate and anonymize the data in the form OD matrices often to provide them, for example, to public administration and public transport companies. So the cellular network provider would be the one who is enforcing the anonymization technique, while the utility is actually finally determined by the user, so the public administration, for example. Next, let's have a look at the data analysis and modeling tasks. So first, in table 3, we see all the statistical aggregations that expert named. I don't want to go into all of those, but just to give you an overview what kind of analysis are performed. Those range from very highly aggregated ones, like how many trips do we have in our data set, how many customers do we have, to how many customers per hour of day do we have, what is the demand by origin-destination matrix, so from where to where are people actually traveling, what's the speed on different road segments, what is the average trip length, and yeah. For those statistical aggregations, it's a lot easier to provide proper anonymization techniques than, for example, for a raw data set, and also easier than maybe for some mathematical models, which were also named, but not as many. They're also named a lot that are only in the planning. So, for example, next location prediction as a machine learning task, which is a hot topic in deep learning and mobility at the moment, was only named by one startup to be in the planning, but not actually used so far. Also, agent-based models were not already used yet, but are in the planning by a few to replace four-step traffic models in the future. And those agent-based models are also in the need of more fine granular data than models that have been used so far. Now, let's have a look on the results on privacy. First, a few common themes that I identified, and then the privacy-enhancing technologies that are already being used by the experts. So first thing I found was a different engagement of the interviews with privacy measures. So we hypothesized that there's a difference between participants' organizations that collect data themselves and those that obtain them from third parties. So like I already said with the data sources, only the data providers are ones that are actually applying PETs and anonymization techniques themselves, while if parties obtain data from third parties, then they would not apply any anonymization techniques themselves after they got the data. All interviews applying anonymization methods to their data named one of the two reasons: for purposes outside of the scope of the user consented to, and to make the data available to third parties. So basically to comply with GDPR, not to provide privacy to their users because they think that's an important good. Interviews with a business model based on providing data to third parties, such as market research companies or the sensor provider, have a high interest in applying privacy measures, as compliance with GDPR is a major criterion to acquire clients. So again, the user would require that the provider is compliant with GDPR, but the provider is the one being responsible for that. And finally, different experts reported that they struggled to pursue all the use cases due to GDPR. So the privacy-enhancing methods that were stated by the experts were mostly, if at all, very simple ones like removing of personal attributes or pseudonymization. Aggregation was often seen as being enough of data anonymization. A few mentioned distinguishability, so this was usually in the form of origin-destination matrices, where such cell counts would only be shown if they would go beyond a certain threshold. Then we heard twice about coarsening, so for example only showing a heat map or rounding the coordinates to 3 decimal places. We also heard twice about the cropping of trajectories, so cropping off the beginning and the end of a trajectory to obscure the actual start and destination. And then we had one participant from a market research company was the only one who actually talked about adding noise, about data synthesization techniques, about differential privacy, and about decentralized data processing, though all of those more advanced techniques were only named as they heard of it, they considered it, they might be trying it out, but none of the measures were already in place. As a final conclusion of my talk, I want to provide the practical implications that I derived from the results from the expert interviews. So the first is that guidance and clarity on the use of state-of-the-art privacy-enhancing methods is needed. For example, a framework which compiles practical real-world use cases and suggests adequate privacy methods, as there's a lot of unclarity within the practitioners as to what state-of-the-art methods are, how they could be applied, and what are actually the implications for them. Then easy-to-use tools for pets will enable organizations without the expertise and resources to implement state-of-the-art methods. For example, a few experts also said we don't have the resources and the knowledge to apply any complicated algorithms or mechanisms to provide privacy. So if there's not any tool, then this is not really feasible for them. Also, standardized similarity measures and downstream tasks would facilitate the comparison of the impact on utility of pets. So what do I mean with that? If we go back to the context that I showed at the beginning, we can evaluate the privacy enhancement with similarity measures by comparing the results with and without privacy enhancement. And such similarity measures are not very standardized for mobility data, but every author, every approach uses whatever suits for their purposes, which makes it very hard to compare different approaches with one another. And then finally, GDPR certificates for pets could accelerate the processes within organizations and provide security for decision makers, as approval processes due to GDPR can take quite some time within the organizations. So thank you very much. Feel free to contact me and have a great rest of the PETS conference.